Hello, my darlings, and welcome to Radio Wasteland, the best show on the planet about the paranormal, government conspiracies, and all things in between. I'm your host, Chauncey Allworth, and this is my co-host, Sean. Sean, how are you doing tonight?
Oh, boy, how am I doing?
I don't know. I just asked you.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I'll just say that the name of our show has never been more apt.
Yeah, ain't that the truth?
We are radio, coming to you all live from the wasteland.
It totally is the wasteland. For those of you who don't know, on the worldwide market, we are coming out of Redding, California, and around us 100,000 acres almost has just burned. So Sean is actually calling in from beautiful, wet Washington, right? I don't know. Maybe we lost him. Basically, we didn't know if Sean would be able to call in. We didn't even know if we were going to be able to do this show tonight because it is just so brutally burnt around here, you know. And I kind of grew up as one of those kids who, you know, didn't have a lot of respect for my first responders in this world. But, man, to watch a problem and watch a bunch of people run towards it is really quite eye-opening on the situation. It's like you think about a cop and you think about me and you create a situation. Okay, there's a guy in there with a gun. Who's going to run in and take care of it? And I'm all, well, not me. So hopefully that guy. So I really have a lot of respect for these first responders. Sean, you there?
Oh, yes. I am back. Yes, so I am not actually in the wasteland currently. I am coming to y'all from Squim, which is in Washington. And it has a cool breeze, and you can see Canada just right there across the channel, which I don't know, makes me feel safe somehow.
Right.
So
nothing feels safer, at least more polite than Canada.
Yes.
Right.
The home where I was living has almost certainly burned to a crisp, so that's interesting. Yes.
Oh, really?
Well, that entire neighborhood, really.
Oh, wow. So I didn't know this. I knew that you had evacuated. Well, you were gone, and then the evacuation order came through.
Exactly,
and then
yes. We were on vacation up in Washington anyway, visiting grandparents. And we were like, oh, boy, it's going to be smoky when we get back down to Redding. Isn't that fun? And then we kept listening to the news, and the fire kept getting larger. And then eventually we realized it makes no sense to go back down, even though that was our plan. Let's stay here.
So you have a wasteland to possibly return to.
Pretty much, that's fair to say.
Well, when and if you do come back, what we need to do is get a single lamp and a couch to put where your house used to be so that we can take a picture of you sitting on it.
Yes.
That would be awesome. We were actually had like a volunteer deal to evacuate, and we decided that we were going to evacuate, you know, just for a couple of days, just to get out of the mess. And if our house burned, well, then it burned. But we didn't have renter's insurance. So we called and we got renter's insurance, and it kicked in at 12:01, which was like 6 hours later. So we sat around and packed up and waited till 12:01. And once the renter's insurance kicked in, well, then we cut out of town for a couple days.
Yeah.
So for those of you who don't know out there, it really only takes about 6 hours for your renter's insurance to kick in. So, I would get it, you know. And it's cheap. It's so cheap.
Yeah, don't buy it till you need it, you know. It's all good.
Right.
This is the lesson you've learned on KCNR Radio.
Right. Well,
you know, why can't Redding's been in the national news, and it's like it's never in the national news for something fun. It's never, I'm here in Redding, California, where they've developed a new type of cotton candy that's 300% more delicious than the old type of cotton candy. It's, I'm here in Redding, California, where half of the town is burned to cinders.
Right, where it's hell on earth. Yeah. And
you
really,
know, it's never fun.
Being hell on earth is really the only reason why we ever make it into the national news. Because even when we're not on fire, we'll make it into the national news sometime for just being incredibly hot.
Exactly.
Or for, like, people being abducted. Or just really terrible stuff. And, you know, I got to remind the world that while Redding is small, It is, the only hub between, like, Sacramento and, like, anything going on in Oregon. So it's like, you got to give us a little break here.
Yeah, that's true. That is true. But, I'm still just reminded of, the recent It that comes out. And one of the trailers, the kid's like, Derry's not like any town I've ever been in. Kids disappear at 3 times the national average. And I'm just like, have you been to Reading?
Right. So you think there's a killer clown running around Reading?
I don't know what we have. It's quite possible.
Not anymore now that you're in Washington.
Yeah, well, I'm sitting pretty killer clown-wise. I have no fear of clowns.
Yeah, I really want to move to Washington, but my wife is all about the sun, and she needs the sun, and so she thinks it's going to rain constantly if we move up there.
Isn't your wife like the stereotypical goth individual, though?
Yeah, but she can't help it. She was, like, naturally born with, like, pale skin and
with
black
the goth
hair.
gene, yeah.
Right. To the point
but
where...
it makes no sense to me that she likes this.
She loves it. Yeah, I don't know. She's so genetically gothed out that my kids and her friends used to call her Goth Mom when they were growing up.
Right. Which is appropriate.
It is appropriate. Yeah. We were at this club one time, and this girl wanted to fight her over some line in a hot dog stand, and Terry's just all like, yeah, but we were here first, and this girl's all, whatever, Gothica, and Terry's all, what? Because she'll wear, like, a flower in her hair and, like, some flowery hippie dress, but still, she's Gothica, apparently.
Yeah, then she would just, look like a goth wearing disguise.
Right, totally. You're not fooling anybody.
Exactly.
Right. All right. So tonight, our guest, Sean, very exciting. You're probably just going to listen in on this one, but our guest tonight is returning. He's Rob Shelsky. He was here with us before. I'm sure you remember where we did time travel evidence.
Travel fame.
Yeah. And tonight he's going to talk about his book, Invader Moon. So I'm not sure where your knowledge level is on the possibility that the moon was manufactured and not a naturally occurring body. But mine is pretty low, other than knowing that it's a thing out there.
Well, we will be learning about this for the first time, just like all our listeners out there.
Yes, we will. You are listening to Radio Wasteland. When you come on back, we have our guest, Rob Shelsky, to talk about his book, Invader Moon. All right, welcome back to Radio Wasteland, and our returning guest, author and researcher Rob Shelsky. Before he was on here talking about the evidence of time travel, but this time we're talking about his book, Invader Moon. You there with us, Rob?
Yeah, I sure am.
How are you doing?
Not too bad. I hear you guys in Reading aren't doing quite so well, though. It's terrible, the fires you've been having.
Well, thanks to the firefighters, we're no longer really in immediate danger, but we definitely were, and it looked like the apocalypse around here for a couple of days.
Well, I'm glad the worst is past, hopefully, and that you guys can get on with your lives again, and that not too much damage was done.
No, yeah. Well, it's still burning out there for some of the outlying folks, but the bulk population is safe for now. Yeah.
Well, good. I'm glad to hear it. I wish I could say the same for the people on the moon.
Yeah. So this is a really fun topic for me because, this is a new one for me. Probably like the last 2 or 3 years, I really sort of gained knowledge that this was even potentially a thing. And, I was born in 1976. A year later, Star Wars came out. So pretty much everybody from my age on, the idea of a moon being manufactured thanks to the Death Star, where they're just, that's not a moon, really piqued my interest when the topic came up. But how long has this actually been something that, why don't you explain to us what the moon might be, if not a naturally occurring satellite of our planet? Let's start there.
Well, okay, in my opinion, it is a satellite of sorts. I mean, I do believe the moon is a natural object that has been modified. That modification can either be through the use of caverns or lava tubes that existed on the moon and that were dug out even more, or that the moon could have been created to have a hollow center. And the idea behind that is not dissimilar to what Carl Sagan said with what we could do with asteroids, that they would make a much better space station than building one from scratch, much cheaper, much easier, and much more effective. Well, it could be that someone did the same thing with the moon, and there does seem to be evidence for that fact.
Okay, so let's go back to my initial question, and seeing how I just came around to really sort of grasping that this was potentially a thing like 3 years ago, I got to ask, like, how long has this actually been bounced around as a possibility?
Well, it's been the idea of the spaceship moon theory, which is what two scientists called it in the Soviet Academy back in the 1970s, around the time you were born, by the way. They came up with the idea that the moon might not be a natural object. And the reason they decided on that is because the moon has so many oddities about it that none of our theories seem to be able to give us a good idea of why the moon is even there. In fact, one famous scientist even said it's easier to explain the non-existence of the moon than it is to explain its existence. I mean, it is that odd a body. It's probably one of the oddest satellites or planets in the solar system. For one thing, I mean, there's nothing about it that seems to be normal by comparison to other places. So that got them going, and they theorized that perhaps the moon had been moved into orbit and that it had been hollowed out, or at least partially hollowed out, and been used for a base. And oddly enough, the spaceship moon theory is the only theory of all five, or even if you want to count the other one, 6 theories of the moon, including the most recent, the impact theory that created the moon. It's the only one that answers all the problems we have with the moon, all these oddities. It alone actually satisfies every criteria for why the moon is there and what it's made of and the whole bit.
Now, the impact theory is what mainstream science is running with right now, right?
Right. It's the idea that a planet that they've named Theia, Mars-like or slightly smaller, impacted the Earth several billion years ago, close to the formation of the Earth itself. They were protoplanets, in that the two planets collided, debris was thrown up into orbit, and that debris eventually settled into our moon, and voila, we have our moon. But there are so many problems with this theory that another theory came out after it, which most people haven't given much credence to, and it's the georeactor theory, and that is that there's a great deal of radioactive material near the equator of the Earth. The Earth was spinning pretty quickly. There's a massive georeactor explosion, and that projected some of our mantle out into space, and that became the moon. Unfortunately, that theory, too, has a lot of problems with it, and they include all sorts of things like the current orbit of the moon, the speed of the moon's orbit, the right angular momentum factor, you name it, there are problems with it. There are with the impact theory. The impact theory doesn't explain quite a few things. That it explains some, but not all of the problems with the moon. For instance, if the moon came from an impact between the Earth and another planet, then there should be evidence of the other planet on the moon, since the moon was formed from both of the debris of both planets. But there isn't. The oxygen isotopes on the moon show that it mostly seems to be made up of the Earth's mantle and not of anything else. In fact, we have no evidence for the planet Theia on the moon at all. It seems as if everything on the moon was formed from material from the Earth. Well, what happened to Theia? There must have been some debris that was thrown out into space. You can't collide two planets without having a major cataclysm, a catastrophe. But
that's a good point. The moon is very large.
There's nothing on the moon to prove it.
That's a good point. The moon is very large to not have some amount of debris floating out there, if that was the case, even here billions of years later.
Right. If there's debris from the Earth on the moon, billions of years later, why isn't there debris from Theia on the moon? And yet none of our lunar landings have brought back any rocks that show the oxygen ratio isotope of anything other than the Earth. And that's quite a signature, because everything in our solar system has a different signature in that regard, including that's how we know when a meteorite's from Mars versus from the moon or from somewhere else. It is very reliable. And also, by the way, you referred to the moon as being very large. It's too large for its size. The density of the moon is too low, which has made scientists theorize that either it has no core at all, or it has a very strange sort of interior that we are not familiar with, because the density of the moon is a good deal lower than the density of the Earth. Now, it's supposed to be made up of the same material as the Earth. So where is it? The moon also rings like a bell. You strike it and it rings like a bell, not just for a little bit, for hours. And that's another problem. It made some scientists say, including one from NASA, say that it raises the alarming possibility that the core of the moon is no core at all, that it's hollow. And this goes on and on and on. Plus, we have historical evidence for the fact that the moon might not have always been in our skies. And it seems to all date to just about 12,000 years ago, as if something happened then. And there is evidence in the historical writings of Aristotle, of Apollonius, of Anaxagoras. There's also evidence from tales and legends from the New World. There's even legends relating to the Great Flood that talk about the fact the moon was not in the skies before the Great Flood, but only appeared afterwards. This is a worldwide phenomenon. There are tales from tribes in Central and South America that preface their stories with, in those days before there was a moon. Aristotle referred to a people he referred to as the proselynes, the people who lived in Greece before his race did, and he called them proselynes because they were before the moon. The Mayans refer to a time when only Venus ruled the heavens and the moon was not to be seen. And in fact, the Mayan culture is very big on Venus. It figures prominently in their astronomy and in their religion. The moon doesn't at all, which is odd. So, also, we have no historical paintings of the moon or renderings of the moon that date back more than a couple thousand years ago. We can't account for that because there's paintings and drawings on cave walls and stuff by cavemen of Venus and of various stars, but of the moon, almost nothing at all, and nothing that dates back to 12,000 years ago. So this is very strange, too. And so there seems to be a lot of corroborating evidence for the idea the moon wasn't always in our skies.
So we got about 3 minutes till commercial break, but the argument from the mainstream science fans out there who are listening are going to hit the fact that, well, not the fact, but the idea that without the moon, it's suggested that life probably wouldn't have evolved on Earth because the moon protected us so much through the evolutionary process.
Right, and that is a theory that is rather flawed because we now have pretty good evidence that Mars was once very Earth-like a few billion years ago. Mars had an atmosphere. It had a lot of water. In fact, there's still water on Mars now. They just found a lake beneath the South Pole. And we also are pretty sure that life was on Mars at one time, at least microbial life. We have a fossil that has been recently tested again that came from Mars in a meteorite, and it shows signs of it. We have seasonal methane on Mars, which seems to be what we have on Earth due to life. There's a lot of things now pointing to the fact that there must be at least microbial life on Mars. Well, if this is so, how did Mars manage it? Because it has 2 moons, yes, but they're tiny little things. They're hardly larger than asteroids, or actually not even as big as some asteroids. And these certainly had no effect on the evolutionary cycle on the planet or protecting the planet or keeping it even stable. And by the way, the angle of tilt of the planet Mars is not very dissimilar from that of Earth. And yet we think that without the moon, we'd be all over the place, rolling on our side and tilting very far, causing extreme weather patterns and freezing and melting all over, repeatedly. Well, Mars doesn't seem to have undergone that at all, and it doesn't have our moon.
All right. Well, we're coming up on our first commercial break here. You're listening to Rob Shelsky, and we're talking about his book, Invader Moon. Was the moon manufactured? You're listening to Radio Wasteland. Come on back. All right, welcome back to Radio Wasteland and our guest, Rob Shelsky, and we are talking about his book, Invader Moon, and we're talking about whether or not the moon was manufactured. Rob, I got 2 questions for you. Let's hit the first one is, before the commercial break, you suggested that there were 6 possibilities of what the moon was, and we talked about 3 of them. One was that it was hollowed out to be used as a base. One was the impact theory. One had to do with an equatorial supervolcano or something like that. What are the other 3?
Okay, the first theory of the moon, the one that came out pretty early on, was the theory of capture, and this was popular for a while. It was the idea that the moon was just passing by and the Earth sort of grabbed it. That theory doesn't work at all because it doesn't explain the moon's current orbit. It really shouldn't have actually gone into such a nice circular orbit. It shouldn't have gone into orbit hardly at all. If it did, should have been highly eccentric. Far more likely the moon would have been shot out of the solar system and or the Earth along with it in another direction. So that was the problem with the capture theory. And then, of course, there was the theory of accretion. And this is the idea that the moon just sort of formed along with the Earth in the early solar system, and therefore it became stuck with us like a double planet system. Again, there's a lot of problems with that because it doesn't explain why the moon had such a small anchor, if at all, comparatively speaking, to that of the Earth. This should have been much more proportional. The angular momentum is all wrong. And there's a number of other problems with it, so they kind of threw that one out. Then there was the theory of fission, and Charles Darwin is the kind of one who came up with this one. He said the Earth was spinning really quickly, and there was a bulge at the equator, or at least on the Earth, and then finally the moon just broke free of it and went into orbit. And he thought the Pacific Basin was where the moon must have come from. Well, we've since learned that the Pacific Basin rocks are not nearly as old as the moon, and that there were giant continents, supercontinents on the Earth, and that the so-called hole wasn't there when the moon was formed. It couldn't have been, so that was out. And also the oxygen isotope ratio of rocks on the Earth, as we now know, the Pacific Basin is far younger than that of the rocks on the moon. And then there was that georeactor explosion, which says you have a lot of nuclear material. There was a natural chain reaction, and it blew off, but it had to be right at the equator, which is another problem. You had to reach critical mass. You had to have a heck of a lot of this radioactive mass. It had to be right at our equator, and it had to just blow out just perfectly. And again, we can't get the orbit of the moon that we have now from this kind of star. Again, the right angular momentum is wrong with the moon. We just seem to keep on going. The impact theory, same thing. We should have material on the moon from Theia, and we don't. The crust of the far side of the moon is thicker than the crust of the near side of the moon. There's the top three layers of rock or soil on the moon are reversed. The densest material is on top, and then you have a lighter layer, and then a lighter layer below that. Our massive craters on the moon are very shallow, and they should be very deep, and the small craters are very deep. And this lends the idea to those two Soviet scientists, Vasin and Sherbakov, that there might be an inner shell of the moon, a metallic shell that is below the outer crust, and that the moon really is hollow inside. So there's a lot of other problems with the moon. The moon's orbit is too circular. It's the only moon in the entire solar system out of dozens and dozens of moons that is just at the right distance from the Earth to allow for the perfect solar eclipses with it. And also we even have it rises and sets along our horizon just as the sun does with regard to the vernal and autumnal equinoxes. So how is that possible? And what a coincidence. In fact, Isaac Asimov, a noted science fiction writer and also an author of many books on physics and astronomy, he talks about the fact that the moon was a miracle. And when scientists start saying that the moon is a miracle or a blessing, as one of the scientists put it, you have to begin to wonder if it really was a blessing or a miracle, or if it wasn't somehow placed where it was and it was altered in some way. And again, we have Neptunium-237 found on the moon. It has a half-life of less than 3 million years. On Earth, it's just in trace amounts because over 4.5 billion years, it all decayed into something else, which is what radioactive isotopes do. Yet there's a fair amount of it on the moon, and there shouldn't be any at all, but there is. There's titanium on the moon in a decent abundance. There isn't much titanium on the Earth at all. That's why it's rare and very expensive as metals go. It's also a very strong metal, very highly sought after. And this sort of thing goes on and on. We just simply cannot explain all these oddities about the moon. The moon has tons and tons of helium-3, an incredibly rare thing on Earth, but on the moon, it'd be great for mining. The moon has a long history of strange sightings on it. In fact, NASA commissioned a report that went back 500 years to about the time the telescope was invented. And we have a history of beacons, flashes, streaks, volcanoes. There are no volcanoes on the moon. And as far as we know, there hasn't been for millions of years. But observers were calling these things that glowed red for months at a time volcanoes. Again, there are beacons, tracks, mists, fogs, lightning, so-called volcanoes. You name it, this has been on the moon. In fact, astronomers refer to the Aristarchus crater as the blue gem, because that has had so many blue glows, blue flashes, blue beacons, blue mists, that it has earned the nickname not by laypersons, but by astronomers as the blue gem. And how can there be clouds on the moon and mists when there are no, or I should say when there is no atmosphere? How can you have lightning without an atmosphere? How can you have streaks and beacons and tracks going across the surface of the moon? Pulses, flashes, you name it, they've categorized, and they're still ongoing. NASA referred to these as transient lunar phenomena, but they are not transient. They have been going on for 5 centuries, and actually they've been going on longer than that. Was a report by Monk back almost 1,000 years ago about something strange happening with the moon, but NASA chose the 500-year period because, again, that's when the telescope had just been invented, so the results would be more reliable with regard to observations on the moon.
Yeah,
and by the way, they're ongoing now. We still see transient lunar phenomena now, and we simply cannot account for it. The moon, as being a dead planet, no atmosphere, and it has moonquakes. It has no tectonic plates. It has no magnetic field, so we don't think it has an active core, and yet the moon has moonquakes. Some scientists said, well, it could be tidal stresses from the Earth, but then when they calculated it, the moonquakes aren't occurring where the tidal stresses on the moon should be. The center of gravity on the moon is off compared to that of the Earth. The moon should have a terrible wobble to it. Earth has a wobble to it, and it's called the libration. The moon doesn't have that. It has no wobble at all, and they can't figure out why, because it should. And again, it rings like a bell when struck. When they dropped a landing gear on the moon or a rocket, it'll ring, and it'll ring for hours, which raises the question of whether it's hollow. Earthquakes on the moon don't seem to travel through the center. One scientist said it's as if the center was made of something that seismic activity can't travel through, or there's no center at all. This goes on and on and on. How do we account for all of this? Well, the spaceship moon theory by the two Soviet Academy members, this is the only theory that accounts for all of this.
Now, this, I might be wrong with my numbers here. I'll be happy to be corrected. So I'm under the impression that the moon is about a third or a fourth the size of Earth, yet it has about 1/6 the gravity.
It has 1/6 of the gravity,
but it should have higher.
If you look at the moon, the width of the moon, as you look at it, is approximately the width of the United States. So that should give you a good visual idea of how big the moon is.
And what is that in comparison to Pluto?
But the density is too low. So, as several scientists put it, either the moon's hollow or it's made of something quite different from the Earth, or the interior has to be quite different in material than the Earth, or there's no material at all there, because they can't account for the low density. In fact, the density of the moon isn't a great deal higher than that of water. I mean, it is higher, definitely, but it is, if you put the density of the moon between the Earth and water, it's closer to water than it is to the Earth in density. And if it's made of the same material as the Earth, the mantle of the Earth, then it should be the same density. It's not. If it was formed by accretion, it should have an iron core in proportion to that of the Earth. It either has no iron core at all or a very, very small one. And they don't think it has an iron core because moonquakes don't travel to the center of the moon. They travel around the center as if, quote unquote, of another scientist, the center were hollow. So this just, again, goes on and on. It's just, I didn't believe in the hollow moon theory. I didn't believe that the moon might be the invader moon. In fact, I was on another radio show, and they mentioned it, and I just laughed it off and dismissed it. And then I began researching it, and I kept finding more and more oddities about the moon that we simply can't explain. Am I saying the moon is hollow? I don't know. I think it's an extremely plausible theory. And if you go by Occam's razor, if you have more than one explanation for something, you have to go with the simplest. The simplest explanation is the moon, although it may have been a natural object once, is so no longer and has been altered and or lunar formed or terraformed, if you prefer. and that it has been placed in its current orbit, and it wasn't there originally.
All right. Well, hey, Rob, this is a
something happened 12,000 years ago.
This is a perfect time for us to cut to our
moved into its present orbit.
Sorry, this is a perfect time for us to cut to our commercial break. You're listening to Rob Shelsky here on Radio Wasteland, talking about Invader Moon. Come on back. All right, welcome back to Radio Wasteland and our guest, Rob Shelsky. We're talking about Invader Moon. Was the moon manufactured? Rob, how much, if any, of mainstream science actually entertains the possibility of this? And if so, what would getting an answer look like? How would we get an answer?
Well, of course, the simplest solution is to go back to the moon and explore it some more. We haven't been back in over 40 years, and there are many people who believe that we've been warned off. That's why we haven't been back, because even if the United States didn't go back, why hasn't any other country in the world gone and landed on the moon? They've sent a couple probes. The Chinese had very poor luck with their rover. It only functioned for a few hours. Most of what we do is we put stuff in orbit around the planet, but we don't go on the I call it a planet because it is round and theoretically could be called that. But we don't land on the moon, and we haven't for a very long time, and yet our technology has advanced steadily. I mean, it was in the late 60s, 69 when we landed on the moon the first time?
Yeah.
And then we went on through to the 70s, but we haven't been back since then. And our technology hasn't advanced in the last 40 years. Why aren't we back on the moon? It should be cheaper and easier than ever to go to the moon. We keep talking about it, but nobody does it. Main scientists do not want to entertain the idea that the moon is hollow, although many have. There's a quotes by a number of them, including some members of NASA as well, that talk about the idea the moon may be hollow, that there's something strange about it, that it just doesn't fit all the categories, that it's easier to explain the non-existence of the moon than it would be to explain its existence. So there's an awful lot of people questioning it, but mainstream scientists are simply looking at the moon as if it were an object that's always been there because they don't know any different, and they proceed on that basis. Is the moon actually hollow? I don't know. It's a theory. Does it have evidence to corroborate it? Yes, in the form of physical evidence, in the form of the problem with all the other theories that none can actually account for the moon in a reasonable manner, and also the fact of historical evidence. Plus, we also have geological evidence that something did happen on the Earth about 12,000 years ago, something big. Crown fires in North America, the loss of all the megafauna in North America, great flooding of the megalithic culture, the drowning of civilizations along all the coastal areas, fires. We just, something happened about 12,000 years ago, and I think it's given us a racial amnesia that we don't know what it was. Yet we do have historical records that talk about a time before the moon, stories of tribes that commence with before there was a moon, a Mayan culture that says there was a time before the moon. Romans talk about it. Greeks talk about it. Again, the Mayans and other tribes in Central and South America. This is worldwide. So is there evidence that the moon might be hollow? Yes. Is there evidence the moon might be an interloper or have been moved to a different orbit around 12,000 years ago? Yes, there is evidence for it. Is it a smoking gun? No. And the only way we can get a smoking gun is to go back to the moon and explore it and find out one way or the other. And I think we should go back. And yet, I also think we may not be able to go back because we might have been warned off.
Well, so the speculation of my science fiction, movie fan brain leads me to if it happened 12,000 years ago, it couldn't have come from the Earth because that would just be absolutely catastrophic to life. So
right.
If something terrible happened
the moon may
here,
have come from the Earth sometime long before, and it may have been in a different orbit, and then someone came and changed the orbit and changed the interior of the moon and made it habitable for themselves. How do we explain mists and gas escaping from the center of the moon when there's no volcanic activity, no volcanoes on the moon, and we see no rifts or fissures on the moon that would produce this? How do we explain it when there's no tectonic activity, no tectonic plates, when there's no magnetic field that surrounds the moon like the Earth or any other planet, and therefore apparently its core, if it ever had one, has stopped moving, stopped rotating? So how do you explain that? I mean, there has to be an explanation, and current theories simply don't explain it. Then two scientists, and again, it wasn't me, it wasn't some conspiratorial nut, came up with it. It was two Soviet scientists, members of the Soviet Academy of scientists, who came up with this idea. And so far, I haven't seen a standard model theory that explains everything that theory does. So going with Occam's razor again, I have to say, well, right now I favor the hollow moon theory. And also, we've been talking about moving asteroids and hollowing them out. If we moved an asteroid into orbit around the Earth, it'd be worth, if it was a nickel-iron-based one, it'd be worth about $9 trillion, which is greater than the entire gross national products of every country on Earth for 1 year. And in the process of mining it, you would hollow it out. And there is nothing safer to inhabit than an asteroid with a nickel and iron exterior. I mean, you're safe from solar flares. You could house up to 50,000 people in a smaller asteroid. It'd be a great city. It'd be completely shielded from the outside. Nothing that the sun could throw at it or anything else. You wouldn't even know it was there. There would be no electromagnetic radiation coming from it, no radio waves, no TV waves. It'd all be sealed up inside. You could live in there in a closed ecosphere for thousands of years. What's to say that some other race in some other solar system didn't do this and set sail on the cosmic sea, maybe thousands or even hundreds of thousands or even millions of years ago? They estimate there are more rogue planets between the stars than there are planets around stars. You could be utterly lost out there. No one would know you were there. You would have no sign or evidence that there was anything on you. You're just another rogue planet. So if there was another alien species that was your enemy, they wouldn't know how to find you. You could drift for thousands of years, enter another solar system, park your moon around some planet, enjoy the warmth of the local sun, maybe go down to the local planet, investigate it, explore it, stock up on supplies that you might need after all those thousands of years in space, and then eventually maybe move on. Or you might want to stay and observe what's happening on that planet because there's life there. And by the way, there is one other planet that might have a hollow moon, and that's Mars. The moon Phobos has a density far too low for its size, and many scientists theorize it might be hollow. Isn't it odd that the two planets in the solar system, one that has life and one that might have had life, both might have hollow moons? Really coincidental.
Right. And, maybe there's no such thing as coincidence, I guess. Like you were saying earlier, when they start using terms, when scientists start using terms like a blessing or it's a miracle, right? Yeah, you know that.
Or miraculous, right. And then you begin to wonder, well, are we talking about science now? Or are we talking about fantasies,
Right.
So,
well, we're here at the end of the show. I'd like to have you tell our audience a little bit more about how they can find out about you and where they can get a hold of your book, Invader Moon.
Sure. They can get my book through Permuted Press. It's also with Simon & Schuster. Which I'm really proud of because they're one of the big 6 publishers, and or you can get it at online at Amazon Kindle. It's in print. It's in ebook format. You can get it. Well, just Google my last name and it'll come up. I mean, anything you want by me is on Amazon, or just Google my last name, Shelsky, and it'll come up.
Yeah, well,
easiest way.
We really enjoy having you on the show. Every topic that we have you on, your brain. I don't know if you're just doing mad homework before each time you do an interview about your stuff, but, man, your brain contains a lot of information.
Well, someone asked me that once. They said, how do you come up with all these facts? And my answer was, I make them up. I'm kidding.
Well, at least you're honest.
I'm kidding.
Seems to work nowadays. Why not?
I research this stuff intensely, and that's why I tend to write books about it, because once you learn enough about something, you can write about it. But I have this fascination and curiosity for just about anything like this.
Yeah, well, I have an amazing memory for song lyrics and movie quotes that I've seen or heard 30 years ago, yet I can never remember to take the trash out. So it's like, I guess you remember.
Me neither, but then I try to forget that one.
Right, you remember what you love.
Right, exactly.
All right, you've been listening to Rob Shelsky here on Radio Wasteland. Thank you for.
And when I stopped singing in the middle, that's Sean's part, so I didn't screw up.